is going to be a video response to WayofTheBastard and his argument from divine hiddenness. I've watched 3 videos of his where he formulates and clarifies his argument, and I've contacted him through PM, so I feel like I have a good gist of what he's arguing for. He sums it up himself in his video To Rational Dawn between 222 and 234 when he states, quote, basically what my argument is saying is that if there is an all-loving God, there should be no such thing as a non-resistant non-believer, but there are, so God doesn't exist. Now obviously Aaron has offered a more robust argument in deductive form, which I will be addressing and clarifying, but the quote is to simply help clarify the issue. Now that being said, I think the argument is problematic in at least 2 respects. Namely, 1, I think the first premise is worthy of some skepticism depending on what is meant by non-resistant, for example, bias-free versus inculpable, and 2, the 5th premise, which is a conclusion, does not follow from the 3rd and 4th premises. Before I detail these thoughts, I'd like to thank Aaron for his video response as always and his active participation in our project. It's always good to meet a level-headed and intelligent person with contrary views. Premise 1 is assuming that given the existence of a loving God, that loving God will bring those creatures that search for him into a relationship just by trying. However, without an argument or a thought experiment to detail why this is, I simply don't think it obtains. A loving God, depending on how you depict it in a thought experiment, does not necessarily mean that he would draw people into relationship with himself. A loving God is not the only factor that is crucial to weigh when considering propositional belief in God. The one genuinely searching for God brings additional variables into the equation, for example, emotional states, psychological states, or hidden presuppositions and paradigms. Now, I'd like to underscore here that none of these variables necessarily have to be explicit either in one's noetic structure. They can be implicitly held, meaning that they are in one's periphery but still contribute to the overall sense of God or interpretation of the evidence. Thus, the concept of non-resistant non-belief leading automatically to a relationship with God is a difficult concept to get a hold of, depending what one means by non-resistant. Now, I know that Aaron has indicated that what he means is one who is a genuine seeker, but there seems to be more implied than the genuineness of the seeker by the term, if it automatically leads to the relationship with God, as premise 1 states. For example, premise 1 seems to suggest that we might further extrapolate that in addition to the genuineness of the search, the non-believer is also non-resistant in respect to any contributing biases, meaning that if there are no biases that alter his neutral perception of God one way or another, this would automatically mean that he would find God. Now, if this is what we mean by non-resistant, then the advocate for this definition takes on a burden of proof that I think is very difficult to defend. Every one of us has hidden assumptions and paradigms, whether they be explicit or implied, which can be potent variables when it comes to belief in God. Further, appealing to the non-resistance in the non-believer does not remove the real possibility that many human beings have hidden paradigms and presuppositions that could contribute in a move to propositional belief. For example, let's assume a seeker does not have a presupposition on God's existence, and moreover that this individual wants God to exist. However, at the same time, the individual has a hidden negative paradigm on what he thinks his family or friends' reaction might be to any possible conversion to God. So while I'm not arguing that granting the non-resistant non-believers actually exists, these individuals all suffer from hidden emotional or psychological states. Not arguing that. I am arguing that the issue is a lot more complicated than just one variable, namely a benevolent God. So concisely, it takes 2 to form a bond of relationship, and both parties will contribute to the depth of said relationship. But perhaps this is not what is further implied by non-resistant. Perhaps it makes more sense to suggest that what we mean in addition to the genuine search of the seeker is that there are typically functioning non-believers who are inculpable, or in other words, there are non-believers through no fault of their own fail to obtain belief in God, even though they sought genuinely and with typically functioning cognitive faculties. I think this additional notion of non-resistant is better suited to stand up to the scrutiny than absolute neutrality, and therefore I will use the term inculpable and genuine to be what is meant by non-resistant non-belief, and I think Aaron will not have a problem with this through the PM messages I've had with him. Now, I am still dubious of the first premise, since it takes 2 to form bonds of relationship, and it also depends greatly on how we view loving through thought experiments. But let's allow the premise for the sake of argument. If we allow premise 1, does the argument hold water? Well, I think a few things need to be said on this. First, Paul K. Moser and Daniel Howard Snyder correctly suggest that the argument from divine hiddenness is rooted in our expectations regarding God, specifically how a perfect loving being would reveal himself, and I would agree. Specifically, the argument suggests that if God existed, then he should make his existence obvious to those who search for him as a way of achieving his goal of human-divine relationship. However, whenever you hear someone make the claim or argument of any sort that starts from what we ought to expect from God, would or should, or what he should do to achieve his aims, you should ask yourself the question, how could one possibly be sure about what God would or should do in order to achieve some goal? Thus, when we apply this notion to the argument at hand, I don't think the conclusion in premise 5 follows from the premises 3 and 4, because the move from there are inculpable non-believers to God cannot be loving presupposes that there is no sufficient reason for a loving God to have remain hidden. Thus, here enters the possibility for theodicies or defenses against the problem of hiddenness. Several exist, and I will offer one in a moment, but first I'd like to address Aaron's reply to Epidemic. Therein, Aaron counters the notion of possible future belief for the inculpable non-believer two ways. First, he states that he sees no reason why a non-believer shouldn't have relationship immediately, and two, he states that he fears that waiting would probably lead to resistant non-belief. So is he right? Does delayed propositional belief automatically lead to resistant non-belief? Or does that act lead to soul building? In other words, given inculpable non-belief, does the fact that such individuals who remain unconvinced automatically lead to resistant non-belief, or could the hiddenness of God lead to a catalytic environment for soul building? Now, I would wager that the latter, soul building, is also a very good possibility and a possible explanation as to why God remains hidden, if we are looking for justification for inculpable non-belief in the existence of God. In such an environment, then, the genuine inculpable non-believer, while seeking for God, might begin to develop character traits through that search and through that process that are more akin with meritorious belief than propositional belief, and might develop such character traits as patience, perseverance, endurance, wisdom, knowledge, trust, etc. Now, the argument Aaron uses focuses exclusively on propositional belief, belief that God exists, as the catalyst for belief in God, which is not necessarily true. What ought to be added to the propositional belief, belief that God exists, of the believer is his meritorious belief, belief in God exists, or character traits, in which is both highly regarded in Christian scripture and moreover could be fostered by divine hiddenness. Thus, when we read premise 2, which states that no one can be in a position to participate in relationship with God if they don't propositionally believe that he exists, this is only part of the story. The second premise leaves out the very important aspect of meritorious belief. So concisely, the hiddenness of God has great potential in removing external constraints, which adds to the acquisition of meritorious belief and allows that process to occur, or in other words, what John Hick calls soul building. So on this view, the hiddenness of God removes otherwise powerful coercive constraints that would remove the ability for the seeker to build meritorious belief on his own volition. If God were to reveal himself and his will in the way required to eliminate inculpable non-belief, any desire that we might have to believe or act in the ways contrary to which he has been revealed would be overwhelmed, thus nullifying the process for meritorious belief. Our fear of punishment, or at least our fear of losing some greater good, would compel us to believe in the things that God has revealed and to act in accordance with them. But in doing this, God would have removed the ability for self-determination, since there are no longer goods and evil courses of action between which creatures could freely and deliberately choose. Thus, we would all be coerced to choose in accordance with the divine will, would all thereby become conformed to the divine image. However, a character wrought in this fashion would remove the process for crafting meritorious belief, and would not be one for which we are responsible, since it does not derive from morally significant choosing. It has instead been forced upon us. So given the possibility that a loving God has a sufficient reason to remain hidden, soul building, I think the argument does not obtain. I'd like to thank Aaron for his contribution.